The field of science aims to provide coherent understandings of our specific observations. Science and its tools then mould those observations in a more general framework to be understood, a coherent explanation which leads to predictions of new observations. As such, when the predictions are actually observed and confirmed, science can again test how correct our present understanding is. For sure, along the way there is some luck, happenstance, trial and error. Generally though, the approach is to start by noticing something, and then to do some more tests or to observe some more things around the initial finding. Then think about how this might be explained, a hunch, maybe a guess, or some application of previous experience and understanding from similar fields or occurrences, and then to form a hypothesis, and then to design a sequence of tests that can falsify the hypothesis. If the tests and experiments fail to show the hypothesis is incorrect, then we might have grounds to assume our hypothesis is not wrong. It does not mean it's correct. It's just so far not wrong. From there we can make predictions based on the model that has been developed, and then set about designing experiments to find out about that. And on it goes. This process has been highly successful, and it's referred to as the scientific method. So, history. Time for a story. And I don't know the full story, I know bits of the details, but at some time in the past, a long time ago in a galaxy close by, it was noticed that suction pumps could only pump, in quote marks, water to a height of 34 feet. And this is where the precision of words used matters. It's often said in science fiction films that take place in space that the alien or the person or the thing was sucked out into space. It's not technically correct. They are blown out. And it's these kind of colloquial terms like sucked out or I've got a theory that confuses what is meant in a colloquial term context by a layman and what's actually meant by practicing scientist, domain expert. It's not the same thing. In polite conversation, I kind of let people get away with saying sucked out into space because I don't want to be that guy. Well, actually, it's not sucked out into space, it's blown out into space. Because it kind of kills the moment, it kills the story. Just know in the back of my mind, I'm going, oh, blimey, fucking hell. Alright, back to reality. So, imagine a thick straw, 40 feet long, then just like the straw in your favourite mojito, you apply a suck to one end. No problem for the mojito. But for our 40, the sweet alcohol, or the ice cold, and the little umbrella, and the crushed, what is it they put in the bottom? Crushed leaves or something or other. Oh, I can't remember. Anyway, so back to our 40-foot long straw. No matter how hard we suck on that sucker, we can only going to get the fluid to 32 feet above its reservoir. It's not entirely true, but if I really get specific with the conditions, I'll give the game away. So, leave a little bit of mystery. So why? Why doesn't sucking harder lift the water in a long pipe higher than 34 feet? Well, you might suppose that nature abhors a vacuum because it's said so often, and therefore it, whatever it is, tries to fill the pipe with water to close down that vacuum. Nah, not really. I recently had a similar conversation with a friend. It turns out a fucking flat earther. Jesus. For fuck's sake, my Facebook friends list is now down to single digits. I've had the purge. I just can't stand the madness anymore. So his point was that we can lift heavy panes of glass using suction pods, and it was the force of the pad sucking on the glass that made it work because nature abhors a vacuum. I was happy to disabuse my friend of this notion. Nature, it turns out, can tolerate vacuums quite happily. Most of space is close enough to a vacuum. And this is where flat earthers get into another tizzy by assuming that all the atmosphere would be sucked into the vacuum of space. Again, it's not suck, it's blow, and gives these, see what I mean about using the wrong words, it gives the wrong impression. And when you let it slide, they start to get crazy ideas that vacuums suck. And their argument then continues that, if space was a vacuum and it would suck the atmosphere off of Earth, because the atmosphere of Earth isn't sucked out into space, therefore there can't be a vacuum, therefore there can't be space. Yeah, flat Earth logic. I know. I mean, I almost feel obligated to play the infamous clip now of Desert File screaming about gravity. If you know, you know. It cracks me up every time. Anyway, what makes the so-called suction pads work on glass is that the atmospheric pressure pushing on those suction cups from the outside results in very high friction between, I don't know, what is it, rubber pad and the smooth glass. It's the friction that does the work. It's not about sucking, it's about air pressure pushing on the outside of the so-called suction cups. It might be more useful to think of them as friction cups. They don't suck, it's friction. So now if I fill in the missing info I mentioned a moment ago and say that the sucking of a long straw only lifts water to 34 feet at sea level, aha, clue. And this is one of those discrepancies we mentioned, the residual phenomena. Why does nature suddenly become disinterested in vacuums at 34 feet, columns of water? What's suddenly different? So the way to think about it is to imagine air pushing down on a lake of still water. So that's about 60, 70, okay, call it 100 miles, 100 kilometres, Kármán line, 100 miles of atmosphere or so, pushing down on the surface of the water. And air it's a fluid, really. It's like any other fluid. It's kind of amusing, again, to consider the quirks of the English language. Flying is really the same as swimming, but specific to swimming in air. It's all fluids. Anyway, imagine then sticking your straw pipe open-ended, on both ends, into the lake. Some of the pipe is now below the surface of the lake. Some of the pipe is above the surface of the lake and will contain air. The air in the pipe, it still has that 100 miles of atmosphere pushing down on it all. So now suppose we seal the top and we remove the air, and therefore the pressure in the presumably the top part of the pipe is now decreasing. And as the pressure in the remainder of the pipe decreases, there is less air pushing down on the surface of the water that's encircled by the circumference of the pipe. So because there's nothing pushing down on that part of the water, it rises. It's a bit of a weak analogy, but consider a cushion with a fat ass sat on it. It's all squished. And when fat ass lifts off, the cushion rises to where it would be sans fat ass. It doesn't just keep rising, it rises to the height its own internal structure can support. Why doesn't the cushion keep rising and rising? Because there's nothing, it's not able to. It doesn't have the internal structure or the mass to rise anymore. The surface tension, presumably the material opposed by the sponge inside trying to expand, and the surface material in tension keeping the mass inside in a stable shape. They eventually find dynamic equilibrium, and the cushion resumes its normal stable shape. Likewise in the column of water. However, the water itself in the pipe, now it's risen a little bit, exerts its own pressure on its own column, so it never gets as high as it could, but at some height it is in equilibrium with the downward pressure of its own column. Since this particular fluid we're talking about, water, is pretty much incompressible, this downward pressure would in effect try to push fluid out the bottom of the pipe that's underneath the surface of the lake, and it would put pressure on the water surrounding the immediate area and effectively raise the pressure of the entire lake minimally, because it's huge volume. And because it's incompressible, the force goes out under the water and actually would cause the water level to rise. But remember, we've got all the atmosphere outside of the sealed pipe pushing down on that lake. So we have two forces now. We have the force of the water pushing up, balanced by the force of atmosphere pushing down on the surface of the water. And at some point, they're going to find equilibrium. It so happens at sea level on Earth with water, that equilibrium, the pressure pushing down on a body of water that has an inverted pipe, the vacuum at one end, equalizes at 34 feet of water. So since we've removed sucking from the experiment, we know that it's not sucking that's a limiting factor. So this illustrates the notion of expanding the frame and investigating apparent discrepancies in our understanding based on actual observations, such as why does a vacuum stop sucking water suddenly at 34 feet? What is the reason for that? The physicist who investigated this, I think his name is pronounced Torricelli, had a further thought, again widening the frame. If it is the weight of the water in the pipe that's equalizing pressure with the body of water outside it, which is in equilibrium with the air pressure pushing down on it, what happens if different fluids with different densities are used? And so he tried. As it happens, he knew the density of mercury was 13.6 times that of water, and when he performed the experiment, sure enough, he found the height of the column of mercury was limited at 2.5 feet, which is actually what he predicted, because 34 feet divided by 13.6 is 2.5. So indeed, his new models predicted previously unknown or previously unobserved phenomena, and when tested, it comported with reality. Further intrigued, he lugged his experiment, which was really a bowl of mercury with a test tube and some method to evacuate air from said test tube, up some mountains to known heights, and again he confirmed his prediction that the height of the column decreased the higher he went, because there was less air pressure up these mountains, less force pushing down on the outside, a body of water or body of liquid, body of mercury, which means less ability to support a column of water, column of mercury, whatever it is. Today we call this experimental device a barometer. It measures pressure. So just to complete the maths, 2.5 foot in millimeters is 2.5 foot times 12 inches per foot times 2.54 centimeters per inch gives 76.2 centimeters or 762 millimeters of mercury. And today we recognise the air pressure at sea level to be 760 millimeters of mercury. We don't use those units too much anymore, but there it is. That's how it happened. That's how it came to be. Interesting stuff, and all to illustrate that investigating the discrepancies can lead to new conceptual thinking. And these leaps in concepts often leave behind them new instruments. And then I suppose sometime later someone noticed that these barometers that this chap had invented suddenly changed hours or a day before bad weather came in. They always noticed that it rained with low pressure. They noticed that it was sunny with high pressure. I wonder why that is. So, as it happens, I was also watching a documentary about the so-called nuclear, not nuclear, but nuclear, just to make that clear, nuclear winter, predicted to occur after an all-out nuclear war. It turns out they built all these missiles and never stopped to ask what the wider consequences were if we effectively set fire to all our major cities, communication hubs and critical infrastructure. Even if only one side did it to the other, the smoke and debris in the atmosphere would block out the sun enough for temperatures to drop below freezing for a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, which would pretty much see a cataclysmic collapse of the entire food chain and ecosystem, thus inducing a prolonged suicide by the attacker. In summary to this model, Carl Sagan said, and I'd love to be able to do his voice, it was so poetic, he said, conventional wisdom, no matter how deeply felt, may not be a reliable guide in an age of apocalyptic weapons. We need to do something inside our head. We must change the way we ordinarily think about this. And he lamented that Einstein said of the 2 nukes dropped towards the end of WW2 that everything had changed except our thinking. Simply stockpiling more and more weapons does not make you safer. It makes you less safe. Wise words indeed, very wise. And I'd add, this is one of those heuristic priorities we tend to have, that we actually value feeling safe over and above actually being safe. But also, it seems like some maniacs like to play these kind of dangerous games. And one of the YouTube commenters took time to leave a note on this video. They said that documentaries like this were made back in a time when people took time and great care and put a lot of research into making documentaries, unlike now, where cheap TV gives equal time to opposing views. So we have a scientist with 30 years of domain experience given equal time and equal weighting against those who proclaim that climate change is a hoax, that vaccines cause autism and that the world is flat and that COVID-19 is a hoax. What the fuck happened along the way? It's cheap TV, because all you have to do is find two people with opposing views, let them spout off for 10 minutes, and then say, there we go, we've done our balanced news reporting. It's just trash. The only winning move is not to be a cliche. I didn't expect that, did you? Cheap TV. Anyway, as I mentioned before on the channel, I'm sure, see Nick Davis's book, Flat Earth News. It's nothing to do with Flat Earth, by the way. It's just kind of how journalism is degenerated. And I don't know when he wrote it. It must be 7 or 8 years ago now, maybe more. But back then he was saying, journalism now is very little more than people throwing their prejudices at each other, and there's really no value in that. Making observations and measurements is not necessarily enough for a science to discover more. We must also ask questions and look for explanations, as Carl Sagan pointed out. As it happens, I'm also reading a book on science and risk mitigation, and coincidentally, the example of the nuclear winter, did I say nuclear then? Nuclear winter is exampled in the book. How come, it asks, we had nuclear weapons since the late 1940s, but it never occurred to anyone that the nuclear winter would be a thing? And coincidentally, it only came to light because of a particular mission to Mars. As it turns out, the probe sent there was coincidentally timed with a global dust storm which blocked out the view of Mars' surface. What could cause that? And people leap to what they know and ask the same question of a more familiar context. And then maybe we can build on that. If we're able to answer the question in a more familiar context, we can expand our thinking, expand our notions, and maybe come up with an answer of how it happened on Mars. So one scientist asked such a question, and that was, I wonder what could cause a global dust storm on Earth. Well, a big fire. And what could cause that? Well, if we set fire to all our major cities, major infrastructure and communication centres, that'd do. Oh, yeah. So this is the thing, all too often there's many risks, and it seems we're blind to the hazards. But it seems we're going to do it anyway, with CO2 and fossil fuel burning. It's going to take a bit longer, but the result is the same. It turns out we fear nuclear Armageddon a bit more than climate change because, well, for most, the decision to launch the nukes is out of our control, and the immediate effects very visible. Visceral, horrifying. People vaporized, liquefied on the spot, burned so bad their skin melts off. And the slow degrading of our environment over the next 50, 100, 200 years, well, that's perhaps not even for me to worry about, nor my kids, perhaps not theirs, maybe the 4th or 5th generation from now. But we're going to have better technology by then, so who cares? Yeah, that's how it goes. Many suspect, many think that they could, in theory, at least change their consumer habits to be a bit more ecological. But like any dieter knows, tomorrow is the best time to start. In the example of the barometer, the insight led to the design of the device itself, an instrument, and also the insight in conceptual thinking and the interest and mechanical processes required to make vacuums in a reliable way. So it also sparked off a bit of an industry. And it is useful to science to have better observations, more precise measurements, more accurate observations in order to progress. It's all about the data, baby. And at the moment, big data is big business. Along with more, better, high-quality data, we also need conceptual models. So, for example, string theory, I suppose, though not strictly a theory just yet. Similarly, as indeed was the concept of imaginary numbers, more on that later, but that enabled all sorts of mathematical insights and shorthand tools to do things very quickly that weren't long and laborious using other methods. I've even heard it said that the number 0 was an Indian invention, as told in a humorous way by Russell Peters in a skit he did many years ago. Yeah, a little bit of stereotyping. Anyway. The map is not the territory, as Korzybski said, but it's good enough to find our way to the nearest burger joint. The representation and approximation is good enough for a wide utility, but not all, of course. So it is with all other models and maps. It depends on the application, it depends on the intent. It's also a disingenuous or sign of ignorance to use the wrong map or model for something it was never designed to do. I've actually seen a few people try to navigate the roads of London using an underground tube map. Just to point out to visitors, there are a couple of stations on that map that require a change to another line to get to that one stop over, but it would actually be quicker to go to the surface and walk the 100 yards. It's only 100 yards in real, but on the map it looks quite a distance, so you think, that's quite a distance, so I'd rather get the train than walk that distance. But because it's a topological map, it doesn't represent distance in any meaningful way. And it's been a wonderful testament, on the internet and so-called interoperability and the development of third-party apps and APIs and OAuth authentication integration, that so many applications have been written to work with each other. We can pull data, push data, cloud data, crunch data, overlay data, share data, apps to make use of maps and then overlay other maps and overlay data, things like traffic flow, things like impediments, paths that optimize for leisure over speed, scenery rather than efficiency, all sorts of interesting things. And again, it depends. Use Google's Journey Planner and sometimes interesting results are presented. Why sometimes does the planner default to bus and trains? And sometimes to cars and private transport, and sometimes it even assumes one is walking. What's going on there then? So I'm not saying it's mysterious, there are actually good reasons that it does that, but that's another story. Whether a model is good or not depends on what you want the model to do. So one of the minor bugbears where I live, get delivery from time to time, and occasionally we'll get a driver not familiar with the area who will come down the drive and he'll be a bit annoyed and said, you've got your address wrong. You've written down the name of the road wrong because it's, when I put the postcode in and look for the name of the road, it didn't come up on my satellite. It gives you a different name. So why did you put the wrong name down for your road? Drives me batshit crazy. And I just go, yeah, whatever, mate, because I'm fed up of explaining. Because there's different kinds of maps. There's one that the post office use, and there's one that the Ordnance Survey use, and there's one that riverway authorities use, there's one that agricultural planning uses. They're all fucking different, done at different times, and historically, for various reasons, have different labels. Plus also, cartographers, I think is what they're called, used to purposely put errors in, misname roads occasionally, or junctions, or put roundabouts in where they weren't, so that when they found someone else selling their map with the same errors, it was clearly that they were just stealing their maps, so they could get them in court for that and press for damages. But this is the thing, these driving companies run on tight margins, and they probably want to buy their logistics data to do with roads and connections and locations and solutions to the so-called travelling salesman problem. They want to buy that data as cheaply as possible. And it may be that an Ordnance Survey map, which uses sometimes different road names to the post office map, which is the one you probably want to use for doing deliveries because it's cheaper. So no, it's not that the name of the road's wrong, it's that you bought the wrong fucking map. But you explain it to them and they just look at you like, oh, satellite, mate, it's only one. Oh, fuck off. Get in your van, piss off. I'm under no obligation to explain it, but I don't understand why I have to endure someone else's mistake and then get told that I don't know my own address, you know what I'm saying? Likewise, it's one thing to know and appreciate science and the methods and the stats, but then selecting the right tool, like effective sampling, into the right model to get something useful out is itself part of the process of learning to do science. And for this reason, some have even speculated that, in this sense, science is a tradition or a cultural process. I kind of see where they're coming from, but I wouldn't wish to grant too much grounds on that. It's a pretty reliable process, has its limitations, has quite well-known limitations, and yeah, scientists do take account of these cultural artifacts that are built into it. So in a way, I fully expect, as a kind of layman, semi-science guy, that it has a self-correcting mechanism, and when a particular process or processes are shown to be inferior, they will be used less in preference for superior approaches. So, back to our lead thingy, and then the UK and US went at it. Turns out, the bean counters have looked at both methodologies. The US version and the UK version, as it were, and you'll be surprised to know which approach is superior. Well, not to tease and not to put you in suspense, it's actually indiscernible. I'm going to go into this in more detail when I do a video or audio, something on risk, because there's some interesting aspects which are intertwined in how the UK legal system, its government and its civil service are arranged, quite different from the United States, and perhaps this illustrates broadly within these respective cultural aspects. UK is potentially dangerous, let's prohibit it until it's shown to be safe, versus United States, yeah, it's likely safe until you can show exhaustively it's dangerous, and you better be willing to go all the way with that. Is that policy, or is that how they approach science? And if it's how they approach science, is that a cultural bias? Yeah, no, yeah, kind of, maybe, yeah, sort of, I suppose. But, don't... I'm just trying to think whether I should mention whether it's a tool of imperialism, as some have claimed. There's a case to be made, I suppose. But I'm not equipped to really discuss that. I don't know too much about it, but I can see the point. Anyway, as to which is more expensive and which is more accommodating of commerce and free enterprise, a worthy question, and one that extends into how schemes like tradable carbon credits come about. So it's pros and cons. Anyway, but it should be noted that where we investigate further, and some observations that we wish to account for are not so accounted for by our existing models, we can ditch the model for a new one, or improve and refine the existing one, in which case the refinement must include the existing model and all its explanations, or the new model also must be able to explain all the existing model's explanations and have benefit over and above for us to swap it out. In other words, successive models ought to encompass rather than contradict the model that preceded it. The next question is then, when is simple enough? Simple enough, but not so simple that it leads us astray. And this is where it kind of gets a bit interesting. Conflict a little bit, yeah. That old favourite game theory. Winners and losers, gains and losses. So a key point in most real conflicts is that each side will devise a strategy in order to win. But whether this strategy works depends on the strategy of the opponent, which is unknown. In which case, what is the best strategy? And some companies, seems to me, those especially concerned with warfare, they take time to compute all of them, so that we know every contingency and can react very quickly in response to when it's apparent which strategy the other side is using. But of course, you've seen how this works out if you've watched the film. The other side, we surely must assume, is doing exactly the same. And if we are really concerned, perhaps we would be a little bit paranoid, and that would serve as well to assume they're actually doing a little bit better than we are. Hence, while the only winning move might be to not play, it may also be true to say, play hard but never move. The absurd question then becomes, how much resources does one want to take up, justifying never moving? It's a bit strange, a bit weird when I think about it. I've read about adversarial machine learning and projects within DARPA to create artificial intelligent resistant defense mechanisms that are basically machines attacking other machines so that they can learn about how to defend against such attacks, and then they learn weaknesses and then try and attack in that way, learn what those are and repeat the process. It's like a self-patch to weakness, and just continually repeating. So the adversaries get stronger as they learn the weaknesses of the other and defend against it, and they just get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, 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 stronger. Algorithms fighting algorithms, more data, more compute power required, more electricity, more resources pulled into an endless computation. We have to assume the other side is prepared to do the same. And this is precisely the game von Neumann described. 2 coins, 2 players. Each places the coin one side up. If both sides match, player 1 wins, else player 2 wins. How then can you decide a strategy that will win? Well, you could lay down heads every time. Your opponent will suss this quite quickly and lay down tails to thwart, or heads if it's to their benefit. In other words, because they go second, they get to see what your strategy is and can play to it. Therefore, laying down a discernible plan is actually a losing strategy. Let that sink in. Yeah, suddenly madness and schizophrenic and hysterical chaos makes sense. Well, it doesn't, but, if you try that, people just write you off as a crazy bastard, and maybe that's grounds in of itself to think about instigating regime change. Anyway, Yeah, so I mean, what about random then? If we can assure our heads or tails is actually random, we lose as much as we win over the long term. Of course, there is the little problem of knowing we are actually selecting randomly heads or tails. Maybe we are inadvertently actually picking a pattern that the other side has spotted, but we believe it's random. That aside, though, this least loss strategy emerges. Similarly, it's why all the coffee shops show up back to back in the same town. There is a convergence in this strategy, so that if you're opening up a coffee shop, save yourself some time, just open it right next door to Starbucks and have done. It's the best place it can be. Of course, eventually the council will block any more than 3 or 4 in the same location, as it's excessive clustering, looks bad, it's kind of, towns don't like it. So get in early, preferably before Starbucks themselves. But there's that problem too. Starbucks spends a lot of money researching up-and-coming areas. Unless you are willing to sacrifice that kind of spend on research to be first, then you will always be second or third, or just get locked out because the town's only going to support 3 coffee shops. Strategy, innit? You just can't get away from it. Anyway, von Neumann's insight was that for any game of zero sum, there is an optimal strategy that minimizes losses to both players. Again, this is a simplified model of 2 players and zero sum. Often it isn't. But what about slightly more complex games and the ones that are non-zero sum? It's worse. I'm sure you've heard of the dollar auction game. It has a simple rule. So we run an auction whereby the highest bidder wins the $1 bill or a pound, but the next highest bidder forfeits their bid to the auctioneer. So the game starts off rationally enough. Let's make it $100, pounds, shillings, shekels, whatever, and not $1, so that we actually feel the pain of the gain. So it's rational, of course, to bid £10 for £100, and rational to bid 20, 30, and so on up to 90, and it's still a bargain. But the second highest bidder is now set to lose the amount of money they bid under the other's counter-offer of 90, or the higher bidder. And because the second bidder is set to lose this £90 or $90 against the other's higher bid, they're rationally now compelled to bid, say, 110 for the 100. Okay, now they're only going to lose $10, the value over the excess. But that's much better than losing 90 as a second highest bidder. But only if the other party is prepared not to bid again for a loss of 100, which they're not, of course, because that's an even more of a loss. And if they bid 115, which is more than 110, it's 15 over parity, but that 15 loss against parity or par is better than losing 100. And so it goes on. Yeah, if I've played this game, don't play this game. Oh, too late. This is the game that Brexit and Trump are playing. Too invested to admit the mistake, too far gone to be able to go back. The loss is too big to swallow, and a strong desire to win, no matter the loss. It's reminiscent of the game of war. Yeah, lots of other games to look at: War of Attrition, Tragedy of the Commons, Escalation of Commitment, and yeah, the famous Prisoner's Dilemma. So if the suspects don't rat, they might both go free. If they both confess, they both get sent down. But if one's made an offer and rats out the other, then the one who accepts the offer is given a lighter, or even no sentence at all, and the other one, they're a so-called accomplice, cops for the lot. That's quite a large asymmetric incentive, because you've got to be sure that the other guy isn't going to rat you out given that kind of temptation. If each player employs a strategy to maximise personal gain, then both players wind up worse off than they need be. However, summarised and condensed and simplified over long time horizons and multiple rounds, the winning moves in game theory are to collaborate with players until the other does not. Then you do not. In other words, be nice and then tit for tat. Surprisingly simple, and I think mostly what people do anyway. Pity then that we don't give first, but always seem to take. Yeah, communism. Nice idea. Seems that humans are just not wired for it, and culturally not prepared. Speaking of which, culture, tradition, and cultural values will trump empirical evidence and logic that leads to very different decisions. Hume's guillotine and all that, we've covered that already. So I think I mentioned, sorry for repeating, but just to cover it off, many of our decisions are based on what we believe are going to give the best outcome, the most utility, and most of the time in capitalist and commercial areas of the world, which is most of them now, that approximately equals money. What's going to give us more money? But the traditions and cultural values can trump that. In some regions of the world, you just can't put a price on an honour. You just can't put a price on duty. And when you try and do put a price on honour and duty, it creates a backlash. You just can't put a price on my honour. You're trying to bribe me or give me money to sacrifice to sell out my country. You think I'm mad? And that's the kind of response you get, and it's often belligerent. Hence, cultural values sometimes dominate utilitarian decision models. Yeah, so the name given to the process of coming back to science, finding relationships between statements in the form of premise and a conclusion that guarantee the conclusion is called deductive reasoning. As we've already said, I think faulty premises can lead to conclusions that, while are reasonable upon logic, are in fact not true. Being well versed in logic allows us to detect conclusions that do not follow from the premise. Personally, I find analysing arguments on logic the easiest. If someone's argument isn't even self-consistent, it's a tip-off that something's up. Either it's a bad faith argument, or they themselves have not spent enough time thinking it through to see it, or they have not spotted it, in which case I can be justified in being sceptical of their deductive capabilities or in their apparent good faith. A valid logical argument based on well-supported premises, hopefully true, leads to a trustworthy conclusion. And just to put it on record, a syllogism is a form of a logical argument that consists of two premises and a conclusion. The premises of an argument might be general propositions or specific propositions about objects, persons, events, and so on and so forth, or they themselves can be conditional propositions concerning the circumstances under which a statement is true. So you can build compound arguments. In a valid syllogism, the truth of the two premises ensures without fail that the conclusion is true. So for me, once I'm convinced the conclusion is true and that it logically follows from the claims of the premises, the harder bit comes, testing that the premises are actually true. The logic can be a bit tricky too. I think in formal logic there were only 24 valid syllogisms from a possible 256 configurations. Some of them are easily recognised. So, for example, if A, then B. We look, it happens that A, therefore it's B. This is known as modus ponens. They have fancy names. Another one is modus tollens. And it goes like this. If A, then B. However, turns out our result is not B. Therefore, A was not. And then we can build the compound ones, hypothetical syllogisms, which have an extra contingency, and they may take the form of if A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if A is the condition, then C must. And we have disjunctive syllogisms, which are the type of either A or B. So happens not A, therefore B. It has to be one or the other, and if it's not A, then it must have been B. Okay. So far, so good. It can get a bit tricky with dilemmas. Okay. Either A or B. If it's A, then C. If it's B, then D. Therefore, either C or D. So now we have a contingent conclusion that, following the logic through, it means that it's either C or D. We don't actually have a definitive answer, but the logic dictates that it has to be either C or D. That's all good stuff. I wish I received a better education. Anyway, yeah, the good news is there are only 24 valid forms to check for logical consistency. Some are obscure and a bit tricky. The point is, though, if we can find logical fault in the argument, we can save a lot of time arguing about the premises or the risks or the consequences or action plans. It's a quick one. It's a quick win. The veracity of the premises don't matter if the logic is invalid. The argument's no good anyway. Hence, the quick test of the informal logical fallacies. Again, see the Facebook group. I've done 115 videos on those. Oh boy, I kind of disappointed when people watch those. They just abuse it. However, and another fast test is if the conclusion of an argument is known to be false and the logical form of the argument is valid, then at least one of the premises must be false. You know, I'm sure there are so many disingenuous arguments put forward where the interlocutor or counterparty scream blue murder that the premises are true, bruh. It's just inconvenient for you that you don't like the conclusion. And then they will distract you with something like, facts don't care about your feelings, bruh. You triggered, bruh. Yet the conclusion of their argument is so obviously wrong, and it is they who wish it to be so. So it props up their racism, bigotry, misogyny, prejudice. Until recently, I wondered why some people are so disingenuous about this. Again, I reflect on MARIE, an acronym that I like to remember: money, attachment, addictions, religion, ideology, and ego. I didn't fully make the connection before. Each of the components in MARIE is a risk, it's a threat. Take away someone's money, take away someone's attachment, take away someone's religion, take away someone's ideology or ego, and what happens? Well, we're in for a bit of a fight. So while these tools of logic and reason and widening frames and bringing context can be brutal, facts don't care about your feelings, attachments, money, ideology, religion, or ego, people don't like being proved wrong, and especially when their income or ideology or identity is pinned to those notions of which they are wrong about. And I mean wrong in all the meanings of wrong that we're discussing here. The truth of their claim is wrong, the moral implications are wrong, and as people themselves, they are just wrong. It's a bit of an indulgent judgment. I shouldn't do that. It's taking a piss. But it seems to me then that we ought to find a higher value in their values hierarchy and pin that whilst we deconstruct the other values that they hold, which are based on something, let's just say, undesirable. I mean, where do you draw the line as what undesirable is? Harmful, hateful, ugly, frivolous? It depends on one's own life mission, I suppose, and there's only limited time, so I suppose, well, I don't know, pick your depth. You know, where do you want to go down to? Frivolous, or do you just want to attack the harmful stuff and deal with that? So, for example, if someone puts a really high value in them being a good person above all else, you know, be like, look, you are a good person, I want to pin that, that's what I want to focus on, and because I know you want to be a good person, I'd like to discuss these lower order values that you seem to have that are a little bit fucked up, that make you not quite such a good person. Don't say it like that, but that's the idea. And I must also make mention that while logic is a tool, it isn't reality, and there is a kind of trendy confusion, a kind of fallacy by association, that since something is logically possible, that therefore it must be possible in reality. This isn't the case. And nor, strictly speaking, is it true to say that something is logically impossible, therefore it can never happen. That's not entirely accurate. But building machines to test these extreme cases, usually cited on the edges of infinities that these arguments create, is technically challenging and sometimes the result of semantic artifacts. You know, like divide by zero is infinite, bro. Okay, we'll prove it. Well, it's that kind of thing. One of the ridiculous ones I heard is that it's possible that cows could jump over the moon if they had the sufficient muscle strength and the sufficient ability to gain escape velocity. Yes, but that would redefine what it is. It wouldn't be a cow anymore, would it? With deductive logic, conclusions are based on a set of premises, whereby the truth of the premises implies the truth of the conclusion through the following of logic. You know, so that's cool. It's unambiguous to the degree that whereby, within the limits of the premises being true and the logic of the syllogism is valid, the conclusion follows. End of. The downside of deductive logic is that rare is this case. In general, premises are not that tightly defined. Consider an apparently hard case. Premise 1. The suspect's car was blue. Okay, what does that mean? What shade? And what light was shining on it at the time? Yellow sodium lamps? Or fluorescent lamps? Or direct sunlight? I mean, it might not even be true, because under yellow light, like sodium lamps, the human eye is, not so good at picking out the actual colour. It could be safe to claim that it appeared blue when I saw the car. It might even be a safer claim to say I recall seeing a car that looked blue, although I make no claim about the reliability, accuracy or precision of my memory. And I think there is a bit of a clue as to what's going on. Certainly in commercial cases, it's not what is, it's what is agreed to. We're all encouraged to make arguments, a lot of the time unwittingly, sometimes by tacit agreement, rarely by our own carefully applied logic on empirically sound premises. Premises. Instead, we can use a different form of reasoning called inductive logic. And I have a bit of a blind spot with this kind of reasoning, I must admit. This is the generalization from specific, and it always feels weird to me. It leads to the black swan thing. Our experience tells us the only swans we've ever seen, are white. Therefore, we assume all swans are white. I never got how you could draw this conclusion. It never seemed a surefire method to me. I always thought, well, that's true until the day that I see a black swan. Will I ever see a black swan? I don't know, because I don't know if they exist or not. It seemed a weird kind of circular reasoning. Anyway, it's perhaps why I'm a bit neurotic and uncertain about things. My threshold for making such a claim would have to be very high. I mean, seeing 100,000 white swans, 1 million, makes no difference. There could be a different coloured swan out there for whatever reason. I just don't know. However, if I was a gambling man, how much would I wager on the colour of the next swan I was to see? Well, I'm not a gambling man, so that answers that. I felt too guilty in the past for taking other people's money who bet on stupid things. Yeah, I struggle with inductive arguments. They always seem flimsy and, in my experience, subject to a selection or confirmation or availability bias. Yes, I realise the irony in that statement, and then the hypocrisy in relying on such a claim to be true as an example of an inductive argument. And for completeness, we can have strong and weak inductive arguments that lead to cogent or uncogent conclusions. If you like, it's a brain teaser to look up the Raven paradox. Again, I'm not sure I get it. I don't know if this is because I have a cognitive blind spot here or because I just don't see how the paradox arises. But this thought experiment somehow, though I don't get it, is to do with what constitutes evidence in confirming or disconfirming things, like hypotheses. So earlier we mentioned what evidence is, the point at which data, facts and information or knowledge indicates or eliminates one position or explanation over another. But what is that? I think again I've got a bit of a cognitive gap here. I've struggled a bit in the past with grounding theory, ideas and logic to the real world, as it were. The idea of the Raven paradox is that a hypothesis that states all ravens are black is equivalent to anything that is not black is non-raven. I have a bit of a problem with that. I can't quite get to it. They don't seem equivalent somehow, but this is the basis of the Raven's paradox. The idea follows that seeing a red chair, which is not black and not a raven, confirms the hypothesis that anything non-black is non-raven. And I think this is where I split hairs, because the reasoning goes on to state that everything we see, like red chairs, green apples, verifiable facts, points of data, that are in support of the hypothesis that non-black things are non-ravens, which is to say ravens are black. So what they're trying to say here is that everything that's not a raven, that isn't black, is evidence that counts for the proposition that ravens are black. And so I think the question is, how can something that's not evidence be counted as evidence? I mean, I suppose if we categorised everything that was non-black and non-raven and then subtracted from the set everything else outside of that, what would we have? Maybe ravens. So at what point does it become evidence? When we've catalogued everything? Or when we've catalogued 90% of everything? 80, 50? So I think this is the question they're getting to. But the way that I split hairs, again, is the notion that science doesn't prove anything. Remember earlier I made the point to say that we can't say that if an experiment does not falsify our hypothesis, it doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's not wrong. So, it comes back to what Sherlock Holmes said, remove the impossible, what remains no matter how improbable must be the truth. And science is constantly eliminating the explanations that are incorrect. So in the case of ravens, I would state it as observing things that are non-black, that are non-ravens, does not show the hypothesis to be incorrect. What remains then? Well, the hypothesis remains. Does it mean it's true? Not so fast. I mean, it's not false so far as all non-black things you have, yet to be inspected for their ravenness remains. And here's, where logic comes in. Well, if it's not false, then that's the very definition of true. Perhaps this is the paradox, but I think it's an error in of itself. Karl Popper stated that the validity of science is founded on the basis of falsification, not confirmation. In other words, instance confirmation is not a reliable way to generalize confirmations, which I think is my whole hang-up on inductive reasoning. Maybe the way to think about it is that deductive reasoning, when sound and valid, tells us what is true. Inductive reasoning, when strong and cogent, tells us what is not wrong. And then I think it's a mistake to say, well, what's the logical opposite of not wrong? Well, it's right, isn't it? Well, it's correct. No, it's not. Yeah, so if you can, if you get, it's on Wikipedia, Raven's paradox. If you get the paradox, let me know, because I don't see it. One of the things I liked about physics, and I suppose mathematics, the most prestigious of the disciplines, is that they have a very long history of robust development and testing. We can appeal to these disciplines and check very quickly our premises without actually doing much work ourselves. Stand on the shoulders of giants and all that. So we can concoct, for example, a syllogism which forms part or whole of a hypothesis with a conclusion that must, where logic allows, follow. We can then ask a mathematician or a physicist if in their library or body of knowledge they have already falsified any such conclusion. If so, and our logic is valid, we know at least one of their premises is wrong. By the way, quick note on the expression valid and sound. I think I might already have covered this. An argument is said to be valid if and only if it takes the form that makes it impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion nevertheless to be false. And we've got to state it in those negative terms for the reasons that we've just laboured. Okay, again, it's like in physics and science, we've got to think about the non-inverse of things rather than the thing itself. It's a conceptual shift. Think about it. We're constantly investigating the edge of the unknown. How can we possibly make claim to know that which is at the edge of the unknown? Except so that which we know has been falsified. That's the only thing that we know, the stuff that's been proven incorrect or wrong. The rest is still up for grabs. We can't really say we know what the unknown is. It's a clear contradiction. By investigation, we can find out what it is not. This does not necessarily reveal what it is. After further investigation, we might find it is also not something else, and so on. And what remains, is even provisional. Well, the uncertainty about what it is reduced with each investigation, and we'll get into uncertainty. So, same with valid arguments. We ought not to say a valid argument is where if the logic is proper in the construction of the syllogism and the conclusion is consistent with the logic, then it's valid. It's very subtle, but it's in there. It's kind of like saying in physics, physics proves that light travels at a constant speed in a vacuum. Strictly speaking, this isn't true, but for all practical and everyday uses, it's good enough, but strictly incorrect. So far, we have not observed light travelling in a vacuum at speeds different than 299 million meters per second, whatever it is. So far. Some might argue about whether we ever could, or whether we ever might. So still up for grabs. But it's approximately good enough to say that light travels at 209 million meters per second in a vacuum. It's a good enough map for what we do with light. Is good enough, unless you're really on the cutting edge, and then I don't know. A sound argument is one that is valid, i.e. logically consistent, and where the premises are true. We come across occasionally the evergreen plans on the internet for free energy. Thermodynamically impossible. Therefore, if we ever have a conclusion of something that claims free energy, that was logically derived from two premises. We know at least one of the premises or claims is wrong. Perpetual motion machines. Yeah, you can still buy plans online for those. Don't be surprised if you get all sorts of interesting offers in the inbox thereafter. You've already self-selected yourself. Indeed, the idea has been around since antiquity and long known to be impossible. I know. Yet people still buy into it for all the reasons. A new twist on an old idea. Sure, for entertainment purposes and what amounts to a desk folly or a doorstep, depending. You knock yourself out. Free energy, impossible. Perpetual motion machine, impossible. But suppose, because everything, tiny possibility, even the impossible is possible. Breakthrough in physics talks about 0-point energy fields. And then people use their search engine of choice and see that 0-point energy fields is actually a thing. It's complicated, lots of terminology, lots of mysterious invocations of quantum this and that and the other. And then they whip out the credit card because they want to jump in early before the masses. More on this later.